This is WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. You are listening to One Human Nation with your host, Sandy Batiste. This program will be talking about race and race relations in your community and nationally. Our goal is to be open, honest, and productive.
Well, welcome to the One Human Nation Show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste, and before we get started with today's show, here's our friendly reminder that the viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or its staff. Well, I am very excited to welcome to the show Mr. Hanif Haynes, Haynes, and Hanif, Hanif, and I guess for want of a better way to describe it, your given name is Herman. So you'll have to explain to us as the show goes on how you got the nickname of Hanif and how you selected that. But welcome to the One Human Nation Show.
Greetings. I'm glad to be here with you.
And so what I like to do to kind of give our listeners a little perspective, because I met you, I don't know when, several months ago, and found out that we had some mutual, maybe family even involved. So describe to us or share with us, where did you grow up, and kind of what time period? I don't want you to give your, age away, you may or may not care. Females, I think we get a little bit more sensitive about that, but where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up in a small community, a small rural community called Pinpoint. It's located on the south side of Savannah, maybe about 15, 20 miles out of Savannah.
Okay, and I'm just checking here because I wanted to make sure that we did catch that because sometimes I hit the buttons and sometimes I don't. But our guest today is Mr. Hanif Haynes and Hanif. Thank you. And he was just letting us know where he grew up in a small community, I guess considered outside of the city of Savannah. For those of you that are listening from some of my friends in Austin, Texas, it would be the equivalent of Austin to Pflugerville, that kind of distance. So it's not that far away. But when you grew up there, what was the environment like? Because it's kind of like an isolated community.
Well, that was, the uniqueness about the community and growing up in the community. And I grew up in the communities in the 60s, 50s, and 60s. But as you mentioned, the community is a small, knitted community. And for hundreds of years, we were an isolated community, and living in that isolation, we were able to grow on the values that our ancestors brought with them from Africa via Ossabaw Island to Pinpoint, and those values of manners, mannerism, respect for elders.
We're going to get into that in a little bit more detail. Because one of the things we've talked about, or what I find interesting when I talk to different people that grew up in Savannah, depending on what decade you grew up, the experience of going to school and living in a particular community was different depending on the decade. And so, yeah.
Yeah, well, once again, growing up in the Pinpoint community, along with Montgomery and the Sandfly, White Bluff community, those areas were predominantly black areas. But we were always bused to school. In the early days, we didn't know integration until, the late 60s, early 70s. And we were attending predominantly black schools at that particular time.
Okay, so, you know, and I've shared this with you before, and just kind of as a refresh for the listeners. So, like, when I started elementary school, I went to a predominantly white school, Windsor Forest, which was before integration was mandatory, it was voluntary.
Right.
So your experience was very different. So which elementary school did you attend?
Well, now I had the opportunity to experience Haven Home.
Okay.
And a lot of people probably don't know the background of Haven Home, but at one time, Haven Home was a school for all girls, and then eventually it was changed to for young girls and young boys. But I attended first and second grade, I believe, at Haven Home, and then we were transferred to Johnson High School. But at that particular time, Johnson had an elementary school that they called Power Lab, and which went from first grade to sixth grade, and then you went over to Johnson after you left Power Lab. But up until 1970, 71, we were experiencing predominantly black schools. Our teachers were black. We were able to relate to teachers and principals because they were almost an integral part of our community. They knew parents. So, you know.
So, in other words, if you got in trouble, it just wasn't going to be pretty. Exactly. It wasn't. We'll talk a little bit about that whole discipline thing, which is kind of a whole nother issue in itself today. So after high school, and it's interesting because Johnson is still, I think, predominantly black. I don't quote me on that, but so after high school, where did you attend college? Well, or what was your path? I mean, I know you. I don't want to spoil it for the listeners. It's your story. So what did you do after, let's say, high school? Well, once again, going back to the community, growing up in the community. The community was a small community, fishing, crabbing type seafood community, and parents didn't make a whole lot of money. Right. And the future for many of us, you know, looked bleak. Right. And the only way out for most of the guys was the military. Okay. And that was the path that I chose. My brothers, they didn't want me to go in the military, but I asked them, well, you guys went, so why not me? But that was the path that I took because I knew by going in the military, when I completed it, there was an opportunity to attend college and vocational school or whatever to further advance education. So you would have benefited from like the GI Bill? Yes, okay. I did benefit from it. Okay, so after the military, which college / that's now university did you attend? Well, after the military, I only spent a couple of years in the military. Got out with an honorable discharge, and my desire at the time was to become an electrical contractor. Good. I like that. A man with skills. I like that. I attended, at the time, it was Savannah Vocational School, which is now Savannah Technical School. Right. And then maybe about 11, 12 years later, I attended Savannah State College, which is Savannah State University now, which is Georgia's oldest HBCU. Okay, so one of the things, you know, when we talk about some of the overlapping in the culture that was in both of the communities that we grew up in, and you know, Pat Gunn, and she refers to it as our waterways, you know, our spirituality, our foodways. But there was another part of that, and that was how we were disciplined. in how we would speak to our elders. And so for those of you that have access to YouTube, you can actually go to and listen to a video about Pinpoint through the Pinpoint Heritage Museum, which we're going to talk about a little bit later in the show. But what was interesting to me about that, because you were interviewed on that video, was talking about the whole, you know where I'm going with this, right?
Yeah.
The whole sandwich episode. So, we grew up, when I grew up, it was no such thing as time out.
Mm-hmm.
By the time you got home, if you had done something as maybe seemed innocent at the time, like not speaking to an elder that was sitting on the porch, you're going to be in trouble. And both of my parents worked, so I didn't have my mom waiting at home, but by the time she got off of work, and got to the house, she had already gotten the story.
Exactly.
And so the question she would ask me was, well, how did your day go?
Well, in that film you're talking about, it is a documentary on Pinpoint. It's called Take Me to the Water. But in one of the interviews with me, I was explaining to in the interview that there was a process that the older people call it satisfaction. Okay. Now, earlier you mentioned about the fact that if you did something innocently, in your sight it might have been innocent, but by the time you got home with that situation, the story of beating you home, so right. Parents already know the whole scoop. But what was so unique when I grew up, if you did something wrong or if you disrespect an elder, that elder had the right or the opportunity to come before your parent, mom or dad or both, to get satisfaction. And what satisfaction involved was that that person would come before your parents, and your parents would have to chastise you to the satisfaction of that person.
Interesting.
And once they were satisfied, then you were off the hook. Now satisfaction could meant getting stiff talking to, or the plum tree switch. You know about that,
right?
Or a switch that you had to go choose for yourself. So, but to get satisfaction was giving that other person respect.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And we had to have that respect for the elders, and whether you were in the right or whether you were in the wrong, you still had to have respect for that elder person.
Yeah, and I was the one that was always trying to talk myself out of the situation. Maybe that's why I do a talk show now, because I get the opportunity to tell my point of view without anybody talking back to me. But
sometimes that works.
Sometimes that's work, and sometimes that's not good, because you can be in your own little silo. And I talk a lot about how we have to open up to other point of views in order for us to have a meaningful dialogue about race and racism. So one of the questions that I often ask guests that come on, and just the viewers in general, was, when was the first time you were aware of this thing called race and how it was impacting you as a person of color? I mean, when did that happen, or did it happen, or?
Well, once again, growing up in Pinpoint, growing up in isolation, we were isolated from a lot of the racism, going to a all-black public school. Once again, you were isolated. However, when integration came into being, and we left the comfort of the all-black schools and the all-black surrounding, was when I experienced racism at its fullest impact. I'm talking about maybe 1971.
How old would you have been around that time?
71, I'm pushing about 17 years old.
17 years old. Okay. Okay, so this was before you went into the military.
Yes, it's before I went into the military. Once again, being in the confines of the all-black schools, there was an advantage at that particular time. Personally, I think integration, the way that it came into being for us, was detrimental. Yes. Because I myself, being a historian now, didn't know a whole lot about myself doing integration, and I was integrated with groups of people who might have known more about their history, more about themselves at that particular time, which would have given them a better advantage. But, when we were studying history in school, when people spoke about Africa or Egypt or any of the more prominent countries at that time, they were not in Africa. They were in the Middle East.
I know.
And, and if you didn't know the difference at the time,
and we've talked about that because it's like, and unfortunately, it's still happening in what kids are being taught now, which is, I think, part of the huge disconnect, is they think their history started with the transatlantic slave trade.
Exactly. Or the accomplishment of slaves, under the oppression of slavery.
Exactly. So I think that has done a lot to shape our youth coming up because they don't know their history. And I think one of the quotes that you have on the video, and I highly recommend it, we're going to give the listeners more information about how to connect with the Pinpoint Heritage Museum. But one of the things you said in not knowing your history is like a tree without roots.
Well, yeah, that's not my quote.
Okay.
Don't give me credit for that. That's a quote by the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey.
Okay.
Black nationalist, born and raised in
I thought it sounded
Jamaica.
familiar.
But yes, Garvey, one of Garvey quotes is that a people without the knowledge of their past history or origin is like a tree without roots. And, if we don't know where we came from, it's sort of kind of hard to steer ourselves in the direction of where we're going to, without knowing, our history. And I know you're going to talk about it in a minute, but that's one of the pleasures of visiting the Pinpoint Heritage Museum, is you get the opportunity to learn about a group of people who were brought here from West Africa to cultivate rice and cotton.
Right. So, and I think that's, I think, and we've kind of touched base on this in some of our conversations we've had, that I think and it just could be my own personal bias, I do think there is a difference in attitude, and I don't want to say all, but in some, the distinction between if you grew up in an urban environment as a black person, as opposed to growing up in a rural environment that's typically more isolated. And so some similarities in the communities, not mentioning having some families that, also came from Ossabaw Island that settled in White Bluff, that now we refer to as Coffee Bluff, which we're going to take care of getting that history told also, but that's a whole nother story. We grew up with, yes, people may judge you that's the story I heard. When I was going to second grade, the story I heard was, because I grew up in, predominantly black neighborhood, went to a black church, and so you just, it did not dawn on me at that particular age that there was any difference from me and any other kid.
Mm-hmm.
And so the story that we were told as the 8 of the kids that were going to be going to this all-white school, we were told that, yes, you may have people that call you names and, that kind of deal, but you're there to get an education. You're there to get an education, and you pretty much ignore anything else unless somebody physically hurts you. Then you can defend yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for a lot of blacks, that's how we grew up. We grew up with, probably to the detriment of our health, we grew up with you just suck it up. For want of a better word. You just, if somebody's calling you a name, that's not a reason for you to lose it, which now you can lose your life, which is a whole nother thing.
Well, it's, now at this age, it's easier said than done. But I read a book some years ago called Your Erroneous Zone by Dr. Wayne Dyer. And it kind of helped propel me, above all of, the criticisms or isms and schisms. And what I learned from reading that is that I make myself responsible for whatever action, whatever you or anybody outside of me may say about me, may call me any kind of name.
Right.
But that doesn't put your opinion, of me above my opinion of myself.
And I think that is what is missing, and not only with the youth, but many of the adults, they just don't really have a very high opinion of themselves. They have, they call it now self-esteem.
Exactly.
I call it self-respect.
And it goes back to, after high school, and I got a little taste of our history, our story.
Right.
And not his story, but our story. And I got just a little taste. And, once you get a little taste of the truth, because, Christ himself told us that, hey, seek the truth and the truth will make you free. He didn't say part of the truth. He said the truth. And the only way that you can know the truth is research your history. And we have to dispel a lie that was, put out there about our story.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of it is, like with my parents, they didn't talk about the history so much because I think they were looking forward.
Exactly.
And so, I can remember at times I would be, because we're supposed to be outside playing, and I can remember times being in the house listening to an adult conversation that I should not have been listening to. And a lot of times when you're hearing things as a child, you are digesting those things as a child. And of course, silly me, I would make the mistake of chiming in like I was supposed to be part of the conversation, which led to a whole nother level of go outside and play. This is grown folks conversation.
Exactly.
You don't need to be in here. That kind of deal. And so that was a huge part of, they didn't talk about it. I didn't know a lot of my dad's history and how he grew up until really after he died, and looking at documents, because we didn't really start having what I call real adult conversations until I was like in my 40s and 50s.
Exactly. And that's, I guess that's one of the way that, growing up in those confined areas like that, I guess they gave you the information you needed to know, and that was it.
Exactly, because some of the responses was because I said so.
Exactly.
And you knew you better run with because I said so and not ask again, because if you ask one more time, it was going to be, beating time.
Exactly.
It was not going to be, it's not even open for a conversation.
Now you're being disrespectful.
And but you just wanted answers. And that was something I didn't even know what questions to ask.
And then too, because of the limited resources that they had, they were teaching us, of
what they knew.
And, I'm still, as a matter of fact, earlier today, I was talking with one of my cousins, and we talked about how in the early days where if an elder person asked you to do something, you had to do it. There was no question and answer. You had to do it, and do
it without an attitude.
And then you didn't look for anything. They said God will bless you, or give you a sweet potato or something like that. And the kids nowadays, you have to ask them to do something, and if you don't have $5 or $6 to give them,
exactly,
it's not going to get done.
It's definitely not going to get done to your satisfaction, but I think one of the things that would be helpful for our youth, because you do have some families that can, when I say families, black families can afford to send their kids now to charter school or some other private schools and that kind of deal, but then it leaves our public schools with trying to fill this void of not only teaching the kids, but frankly raising the kids.
And earlier you were talking about that, and one of the things that I kind of see today that didn't exist when we were in school is the fact that the teachers have to be disciplinarians. I mean, they were disciplinarians back then also, but they have to discipline children, raise children, and try to teach children all at the same time. So,
right.
It's hard for an instructor today, but, and earlier when we were in school, once again, our parents knew our teachers, and it was almost difficult to, get away with anything without parents knowing about it.
Exactly. Well, this is a good time for us to take a little break. If you just tuned in, you're listening to One Human Nation Show. And we have a guest here talking to us about his experiences growing up in, at the time, a very isolated community called Pinpoint here in Savannah, which is always so surprising to me now to get there using Truman Parkway and how quickly it is. Whereas before, if, it was mentioned we're going to Pinpoint, it was like, where? That's like, going, you thought, I need a lunch patch, because it's going to be it's going to be a road trip. So we're going to take a moment here to take a break and do some public service announcements as well as station identification. Thanks for listening to WRUULP Savannah.
This is WRUULP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul.
The open enrollment period under the Affordable Care Act will begin on November 1st and end on December 15th. If you need help enrolling, Insure Georgia is a nonprofit, vendor, and politically neutral assistance program with telephone, online, and in-person navigators available to help. Open enrollment events will be held in Chatham County. Telephone navigators are available at 1-866-988-8246. Online navigators and more information is available at insurega.org.
Thank you for listening to WRUULP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We're Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. So as we continue to have this conversation, one of the things that has come to my attention, and it's kind of like this new term that I hear a lot about that I want to get your insight on, and it's referring to tribalism. And it seems to be more I don't know, politically correct or easier to talk about tribalism as opposed to racism. And in my point of view is until we take a look at our truth in our mutual history, and this is not, as no matter how painful it is, until we know our truth and look at our truth and how that has impacted us, and whether we want to admit it or not, most of us have some type of unconscious bias, and realizing what that is and how that has been infiltrated into our systems of, prison and law enforcement and schools and education and definitely our medical systems, and I had a show on why African Americans distrust the medical system. Well, there's obvious there's history for that, and so it's like no one really wants to talk about what we have to do to reconcile with our history. And I apologize because I didn't have your mic turned up, so if you didn't hear me there for a few minutes, listeners, that's why. So I was going to also pull up a clip that I had at the time talking about tribalism, but I'm sure that's something you've heard more about recently in talking about, especially with the elections that occurred in 2016, talking about how we're all in our own tribes now, instead of, thinking in terms of, and especially true in the political world, that people identify very strongly with being a Republican or being a Democrat. And the more people I talk to, many of them would rather be identified as an independent. Which kind of gets to be problematic with how our systems are structured. It's like, you got to pick a box and stay in it. But there is so much lack of civil discourse around, having honest conversations. But if you talk about tribalism, people can more easily seem to, well, my parents were Irish, or they were also immigrants, in trying to, compare immigration to slavery, and not to say that horrific things did not happen during the Holocaust, because we've got the evidence to show that they happened and they were horrific, and there were people that were escaping that, genocide. But we're so reluctant to talk about the history with Native Americans and indigenous people and what happened with them and slavery, which is kind of the other edge of the sword, because we didn't come here voluntarily.
I generally don't talk about this a whole lot, but,
this is your safe place.
I'm a radio announcer also, and I play a lot of music. I play a lot of reggae music.
Right.
And a song I played recently, by a group called Israel Vibration, and the song is called Pay the Piper. And one lyric in the song, it says, the Jews talk about the Holocaust, the Indians talk about the land that they lost, and then it says, what about the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria? Bringing all of these Africans to the shows of what we call America today illegally. The Holocaust, we call it the Holocaust. But people are reluctant to talk about what the Africans went through when they had to cross the Middle Passage. I don't think there's anything else in our modern history that any group can say that their people went through that was not as atrocious as what the Africans went through, in that Middle Passage, leaving West Africa, coming to the shows of America. Some people even talk about, sharks still even follow the trails of some of the
slave ships that came to the West, because when they incurred inclement weather, they had to offload cargo,
right.
To
and the slaves were cargo.
Right, the slaves were cargo, and I guess they had insurance on cargo back in those days also. But to be thrown or tossed over the side of a ship, pregnant mom, giving birth, it didn't matter.
Right. Yeah, and I have talked about this previously on the radio show, talking about why, as especially for our black youth, because I think when you get to a certain age as an adult, you have to do your own due diligence. At some point, you should be realizing, okay, what I learned in school is not necessarily the way things are going. It hasn't been my experience working. It hasn't been my experience in the military. It doesn't matter whether you were in corporate America or whether you worked for the government. Whether you're trying to run your own business, at some point in time, the stories we were told is not reconciling with the truth.
Exactly.
And I think the sad part for our youth is that we were purposely, as a people, stripped of our identity, stripped of our names, stripped of our language, stripped of our culture, down to nothing, and it was done intentionally. So this may be a good point to mention about, as far as how you got your the name that you prefer to be called by.
Well, Hanif, or Hanif as some people pronounce it. When I was in college, I found my first cousin was my history professor. Now that goes
that's
back
a whole
to
other story.
Pinpoint,
right.
Once again. But he chose the name Ahmed Bim Pianki. He was an avid Muslim. And Pianki was a famous Ethiopian king. And so he was trying to instill, African pride, in all of us, because now at that particular time, around 83, 84-ish, we were having quite a bit of students from West Africa attending the university, and we would greet each other with, a Swahili term or Yoruba term, just so that we all could be on the same page. But I said, well, I wanted a name. I want a name. So he actually named me Shaka Zulu. And I told him I don't know if I could live up to that name, because if anybody know about King Shaka Zulu, those are some very big shoes to fill. But anyway, and at that particular time I was studying Islam also, and I came across a name meaning true believer, which is Hanif. And I chose that name, and from that point till now, that's who I am, Hanif Shaka Zulu. My mom birthed me as Herman, and it took quite some time for them to come around to calling me Hanif, but they finally did.
Yeah. One of the things that was interesting to me, and I was actually looking around for the book. I think I put it back in my bag, but it was a book that I actually picked up at the Pinpoint Heritage Museum, which probably would be a good segue for us to talk about that a little bit. But I was actually very surprised of the connection to the Islam religion and Muslim for the slaves that came over. And I could even see that in some of the names that I had researched for my community, that realizing that, oh my goodness, this was a Muslim name.
You'd be quite surprised.
And so it was very interesting to me to make that discovery, because, the indoctrination was always with Christianity. And there was a reason for that.
And even within Christianity, some of the attributes were integrated into or amalgamated into the Christianity religion. Praying, for example. Now, I grew up as a Baptist, but before, being baptized or after you got baptized or during the period of seeking, you had to pray 3 or 4 times a day. And you had to face the east when you prayed.
See, I did not know that.
Those were traditions that, adapted right out of the Muslim faith, because being a devout Muslim, you pray 5 times a day,
right,
and you always face the east.
Exactly, exactly. So the book that I was referencing that really talks a lot about the Gullah Geechee culture is actually one that I picked up. Let me put it this way, that I purchased, just in case anybody's wondering, don't get it twisted. I purchased at the Pinpoint Heritage Museum, and there's a chapter that goes into great detail about that, as far as the names and who some of the drivers were and their connection to the Muslim, tradition, the religion. And the book is entitled African American Life in the Georgia Low Country, and it's edited by Philip Morgan. But it's fascinating because it will also refer to some of the escaped slaves that came over to White Bluff or came from the time that they were on the either on St. Catherine's Island, Ossabaw Island, or Sapelo Island. And so it's very fascinating to start making those connections, and a lot of it is the history.
Exactly.
And so when I look at some of the older church records and some of the names that I've come across, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is just
Abraham, Ishmael.
Right, it is very much, but it was not something that was talked about when I was growing up. I mean, I was like you, raised in the Baptist denomination, and it was not even a question of, well, where were we before Christianity? I mean, that wasn't even something that crossed my mind at that particular point in time growing up. And I don't remember, and maybe it's because, I don't know, I don't remember the seeking as much as what you're referring to, other than, if you're going to be baptized, you need to make sure that you're ready to commit your life to Christ and what that meant and that kind of deal. But it wasn't until years later that I even connected the dots, I mean, I was like clueless in my own little world. So do you have some insight on that as far as like some of your relatives and what you recall about them?
Well, as pertaining to the Islamic or Muslim faith, other than the idea of facing the east and praying 3 or 4 times a day, but I grew up in a spiritual orientated family.
Exactly.
My great grand uncle was the pastor of the little church on Ossabaw that was brought to Pinpoint, called the Hinder Me Not Baptist Church.
I love that name. The first time I heard that name, Hinder Me Not.
Yeah, I forget. I can't quote exactly the scripture, but it's right out of the Old Testament of the Bible.
And so that's now referred to as, they changed the name to, was it changed to... Well, I know there's probably a story there.
There's a story, and I'm in the process of writing a book to kind of dispel. There's historically there's some discrepancy
always
in the historical records. Once again, I mentioned about my great grand uncle who was the pastor of the Hinder Me Not Baptist Church. Well, once the church came to the mainland, some says that the descendant church is the Sweetfield of Eden Baptist Church, but historically it's not the descendant, because they kind of coexisted at the same time. But historically, the descendant church of the little church from Ossabaw is the First Beulah Baptist Church, which is located and an adjacent community called Montgomery on Railroad Avenue. That is the descendant church because it was pastored by the late Reverend Thomas Bond, who was my great-great-granduncle.
Okay, so that's interesting to know, because
that's another story.
That's a whole nother story.
That's
well,
a whole nother
in my community we have 5 different Baptist churches, so that's what they say, half the story has not been told. But let's talk a little bit about the Pinpoint Heritage Museum and how that all came about and what the significance of that was to the Pinpoint community.
Well, it was interesting. When our community found out that the former A.S. Vaughn's and Son seafood processing plant properties was sold, at that particular time we were our community probably was the first community in Chatham County to be designated as historic. And we were kind of working with Georgia Conservancy to plot out a blueprint for our community, what direction we were going in. And historical marker was one thing that we envisioned. And about the same time, we found out that the property was sold, but nobody came forward to let us know what was going on. But we got some inside information. We found out who the owner was, a real estate magnate out of Dallas, Texas, purchased the property. And we found out, we still didn't know what was going on. So we asked him to come to our little community. This billionaire came to our Pinpoint community with his entourage to explain what was going on with the former A.S. Vaughn's and Son seafood. So they laid out the blueprint and showed us what their intentions were. They wanted to make it into a museum. Okay, so now we have to get the rest of the community on board. And out of that, there was a documentary film also. Some people in the community weren't happy. They're still not happy, but we couldn't get 100% anyway.
You never do.
But that was basically the process. After the meeting with the gentleman, he told us what his intentions were, and the building was completely in disarray. He invested quite a bit of money into it.
So these were the actual factories where people work. Now, we talk about this particular factory was not the first or the second. Now, this was from the 1930s, from 1926 to 1981. Okay.
Now, prior to that, there was still a Pinpoint.
Right,
there was
exactly.
an independent Pinpoint
that
worked independently of the A.S. Vaughn's and Son Seafood. Now, a gentleman by the name of Mr. Benjamin Bond, my great-great-grandfather, and his son-in-law, John Anderson, from Liberty County, which is a county south of Savannah, maybe a couple hours, hour and a half. And he was an oysterman. And after these guys left Ossabaw and they came to Pinpoint, John Anderson married Sylvia Bond, and Ben Bond had already purchased that lot, which was probably the first lot that was purchased in the community, and they established the first crab and oyster factory, which they were very successful until the onset of the Great Depression, and that's when they lost all of their finance. But they were able to maintain the properties, and I still live on one of the lots on that particular property now.
Yeah. Which is what I refer to as, our legacy properties, you know, that kind of deal. And so how, if somebody wants to take a tour of the museum, how does that work? What days is the museum open, and how can they? What's the website?
Okay, now the museum, once again, is not owned by the community of Pinpoint. It's not even operated by the community of Pinpoint, but it is operated by Coastal Heritage Society, which is chsgeorgia.org /Pinpoint Heritage Museum. We are open Thursday, Friday, and Saturdays from 9 to 5.
Okay.
There are scheduled tours, I think 10:30, 12 o'clock, 1:30, and 3:30. I'm there generally on Thursday and Friday. Another young lady from the community, also by the name of Gail, she's there Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. And, of course, there are other interpreters that will give you the story. However, if you want the authentic story, ask for Gail or Hanif, and you'll get the authentic Pinpoint story.
And I can attest to that because I've been out there several times. It's like every time I have somebody coming in to visit me
Yes,
from anywhere, I do. I'm like, okay, so what's the schedule? What's the breakdown? When do I need to be there? And every time I learn something new.
Mm-hmm.
So it's much. It is. You know, y'all have so much information, and of course there's the documentary you watch, and but just being able to go into the different buildings where
yes, you can actually experience the experience of some of the women and men that actually work at that particular factory.
Right, and so that to me, it is definitely worth it. If you have not done the tour of the Pinpoint Heritage Museum, I would definitely put it on your list of things to do. At the time, coming up, it will be Christmas holidays, and a lot of times you have family in, mm-hmm. and that's a good thing to do. There's more to do than what you may think, and instead of just the high tourist stuff that you see on. Not that there's anything wrong with that, mm-hmm. but there is an additional part of our story that I think that people would be interested in, and I know that every time I go through there, I see different people coming through to get the story, because it is definitely something that you would want to experience. So I would be remiss if I didn't ask you this question. So who is, I guess, the famous person that is now part of our governance of this country that grew up in the Pinpoint community?
Well, there was a young man, he grew up in the community. He left the community about the age of 7, and he had a nickname. They called him Boy. But the gentleman now, he sits on the Supreme Court Justice in Washington, D.C., Justice Judge Clarence Thomas. And as a matter of fact, there's a documentary film that it should be out by next spring. That I was working with some of the production people in putting this together, but it's a documentary on Judge Clarence Thomas, how he grew up in a small community of Pinpoint, and how he grew up with his grandfather. I'm not pushing his book, but it is a great piece if you want to learn about the Pinpoint community and the humble beginnings that where he began. My grandfather's son is a great read. Okay,
which is and he's also, when you go through the Pinpoint Heritage Museum, he was interviewed as part of that, making that. So I think it's insightful when you watch that video and his particular portions of that. I think you gain a really good insight, and not only with him, but with a lot of African Americans. Of you just got to pull yourself up by your bootstrap.
Exactly.
That it's not sitting there waiting for a handout. from the government or from whoever. It's a matter of, working hard and, not expecting that someone's going to give you anything. And as I look at the time and I see that the next host has come in, believe it or not,
Yeah.
I will invite you back so we can continue this conversation, because I know there's more of the story to be told, and I see Troy coming in. So I'm just going to let you know, up next is Troy Stoner with Stone Limits, and Hanif, and I know I'm going to get this wrong. I'm trying to get Hanif out, and it's not.
Hanif.
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 I-F. Yeah, I can spell it. That doesn't get the pronunciation out the right way. But thank you so much for sharing your stories and giving us some insight on why we need to continue learning about ourselves, our history, our journey, so that we can move towards becoming one human nation in this country. And it's an individual journey to a large extent to learn the truth, no matter how painful. But thank you so much for your time. And
Thank
up next,
you for having me.
Yeah, up next is Troy Stoner with Stone Limits. What there's always a peanut gallery around here. I'm noticing that. Oh, with Sound Limit. What did I say? Oh, Stone Limit. See, you need to change the name of your show. That's not my problem. Okay, let's give us some little intro music for Troy.